May I have your attention, please? This tape is on the first half of the Flemish School, featuring the artist Jan Vaneyck, V-A-N, capital E-Y-C-K, and Hans Memling, M-E-M-L-I-N-G. Put in the first slide, please. The slide on the screen shows the lofty interior of the Reims Cathedral, a Gothic structure whose vaulting allows penetrations in the wall for the beautiful medieval stained glass windows. These rich jewel-like areas of patterns of colored glass more or less influenced the medieval style of painters, and especially in the northern or colder climates where this type of architecture was more prevalent, influenced the later painting, especially of the Flemish painters, the ones that we are going to study today. First off, you have to realize the different philosophies in art between the medieval artist and the Renaissance artist. The medieval man contemplated material objects as a means of knowing the divine, whereas the philosophy of the Renaissance was a concern for the world as man sees it. A great difference between the two approaches. Slide, please. Where the religious spirit, although beautiful, technique-wise beautifully done, handsome buildings and constructions, almost jewel-like presentations to the religious spirit. The art of the Renaissance came down to the human level then. Slide, please. But the past, with this heritage of architecture and design, was too important not to wage its influence on the Flemish painter. And many of the early Flemings pieced their paintings together, religious subjects, in the same manner as the stained glass window designers pieced their brightly colored bits of glass together. Slide, please. The subject matter of the medieval artist was the humbleness of man trying to achieve the saintliness of God or of Jesus. The depiction of the Christian spirit was all important, the emotional impact on the worshipers as they came into these great structures. The figures were elongated, they would fit within a designed area, sort of bending to fit within this structure. Slide, please. Beautiful, graceful, delicate, yet of an otherworldly quality that had nothing to do with the human aspect of man. Slide, please. And from these rich patterns of these tapestries in glass, we find the tapestries woven in Flanders from cartoons and designs sent from all over Europe at that period. And from these tiny little meticulously detailed panels, slide please, both in stained glass and in tapestry, slide please, we are introduced then to the first artist, the first major artist of the Renaissance period in Flanders, and that was Jan Vaneyck and his brother Hubert. Vaneyck's dates, he was born somewhere between 1380 and 1390 and lived until 1441. And it was with the Vaneyck brothers of using this tradition of this tapestry effect in patterns and colors and richness, but for the first time organizing it into a unified whole, into a composition. We have seen approximately a little earlier period, but of approximately the same time of Giotto's work, or Masaccio's work even in the Italian Renaissance, where you have a fairly narrow depth of field, a fairly flat plane effect. With the Van Eycks, especially with Jan van Eyck in his later years, through the use of perspective, stretched beyond this sort of stage design effect into sort of a vast infinity that opened up the landscape. The Flemings, in their nature, were very much aware of objects and material things around them, and they analyzed them with a very close and observant eye. They put down things with a patience that has never been reached in art since. This is the large Ghent altarpiece that both Hubert and Jan van Eyck worked on. The large area down in the bottom, the most important composition, is the Adoration of the Lamb. And there are other panels or wings to this triptych that, as it would open and unfold, was painted both on the front side and the back side. So you have many individual compositions that you might see from this altarpiece, and yet they're all pieced together, as many of the Flemings worked in these multi-paneled triptychs or diptychs. Diptychs meaning 2 panels, triptychs mainly 3 sections. Slide, please. Then we see a close-up of the central panel in the Ghent altarpiece. The Flemings were not interested in the substructure. They were interested in the surface design, the same sort of flat effect that the stained glass windows of the medieval period gave. And certainly the influence of tapestry making on the Flemings shows to a great extent, where the horizon is sort of flattened out, the figures not quite occupying complete space or atmosphere around them, but piled up in a sense of design of where they're grouped together in sort of embroidered areas. Then the areas in between the groups of figures would be then decorated with flowers and bits of nature. Slide, please. And a closer detail in the lower left-hand corner of the Adoration of the Lamb. Van Eyck knew something of anatomy through his ability of drawing, of putting down things, his observation. But the substructure was unimportant. The effect that he wanted to achieve was a clear, crystal, rich, colorful presentation of the scene within the composition. Slide, please. We are very familiar with this painting, Van Eyck's masterpiece, now hanging in the National Gallery in London. A medium-sized painting, about 20 by 30 inches, and it is a dual portrait of John Arnolfini and his wife. Arnolfini was an Italian merchant in the city of Brussels, and called upon Van Eyck to do this wedding portrait. At the time in Brussels, a couple could be married by mutual consent without benefit of clergy. And then at some time during their married life, sometimes before the ceremony, sometimes many years afterwards, they would commission an artist, and depending on their own wealth, the amount of money that they could spend on the portrait, the fame of the artist too, would have the wedding portrait. There was more or less a contract, an agreement between the two people. This painting still today is crystal clear, the colors fresh, vibrant. The Van Eyck brothers are credited with using oil as a medium much the same way as we use it today. Before this, especially in the Italian Renaissance, the painters used oil only as sort of a surface protection, but did not combine the pigment with the oil mixture itself. The Van Eycks also had secret varnishes whose formulas are lost to us today and defy any analyzation, but have protected the colors, and the varnishes have not yellowed and have stayed crystal clear. The beauty of this painting is in its organization. Certainly the two figures are not handsome enough to gain our attention, but it is a compelling composition. He uses the two large forms placed on either side of the painting, where your eye sort of bounces back and forth between the two dominant forces, sort of equal dominance, and yet the whole center focus of the painting is on the little mirror in the background. So even though the space is an interior and it has confined depth, your eye is being constantly pulled toward that bullet round shape in the center background, and then by the dominant force of the figures themselves as you pull back forward into the space. It is known that there are a lot of symbols used in the painting. At first glance, it's just sort of a comfortable Flemish interior of the early 15th century. The people certainly are well dressed. It seems like a very wealthy household. But then you see some odd things. Why don't they have their shoes on? Why are they so dressed up within the interior? Why do they look so solemn? Why is there only one candle in the chandelier? All of these are answered in the fact that it is a wedding contract, that rather than spelling out the terms in words, Vaneyck, the artist, has used picture symbols or visual symbols to designate the different parts of the contract. The little dog could have been a pet in the family, but at that moment in history, the dog was also a symbol for faithfulness. Both his slippers, Mr. Arnolfini's in the lower left, and hers, the red ones, toward the center background, indicate that this was a very solemn occasion from the biblical quotation, "Tread not, for this is holy ground." They are dressed in their finest array. Slide, please. The close-up of Mrs. Arnolfini in her elaborate wimple, the name of the headdress at the time, usually the one worn just on everyday occasions, did not have the ruffles and was a much more simple garment. Her heavy dress that she holds up in front of her with the extremely high waist lined with fur, a great attention to these sort of surface textures that you get a feeling of the heaviness of the wool in the dress and the softness of the fur that outlines the sleeve and the neckline. The hairdo and the very elaborate braided and twisted conical shapes was a fashion of the times. Slide, please. But as I said, our main attention is constantly drawn to the center of the painting, toward the background. The attention to detail, like the intricately carved bedstead in the Gothic pattern, carved wood, where you have a sort of a lacy pattern, tracery work, a peculiar little whisk broom hanging on the bedstead, meant a clean household. The little carved figure used as the finial on the bedstead is of St. Catherine, the patron saint of childbirth. You have a string of topaz or amber beads hanging to the left of the mirror that was a sign of purity. And then within the mirror itself, a gem of a work, you have the Passions of Christ in little medallions no larger than the size of a dime. And reflected in this convex mirror, which then sort of opens up the room a little bit more. You see the reflection of the mirror of the window that allows the light to enter the room for the portrait, the backs of the Arnolfinis, and in the opposite doorway, two figures, supposedly one of which is the self-portrait of Vaneyck, who become the two witnesses for this ceremony. The beautiful brass chandelier has only one candle in it, and that candle being lighted is a sign also of purity, or the seeing eye of God. And signed with a flourish on the back wall, when artists usually never signed the front of their paintings at this point, in Latin, and also in the script used in legal documents at the time, is Jan Vaneyck was here, 1434. In a closer detail of the little convex mirror. The little figures, especially being that small in scale, you can recognize the scenes, knowing the chronological events of the passions of Christ, and they are done to a great extent in detail. But if you can imagine that each little composition, many filled with figures of being only about the size of a dime. Slide, please. Another one of his major compositions was the Madonna with Canon van der Pijl. Most of the Flemish painters, they used sort of a rigid church, and with the importation of oriental rugs from the East that the Dutch trading companies did at that time, in many cases used rich materials and these oriental carpets as part of the decoration within the Madonna paintings. This is a more centrally composed piece, the Madonna, of course, occupying the major position in this composition. And then we have sort of a balanced imbalance where we have the Chancellor Roland over on the Canon van der Pijl over on the left-hand side in sort of a bulky, large, textured, elaborately designed cape, balanced by two figures of a little more simple nature, the donor, who is kneeling, and his patron saint, St. George, that's sort of tucked away in the shadows behind him. Supposedly in this too, in the St. George's armor, there's a little reflection of a self-portrait of Van Eyck. The attention to detail is immaculate. Every little piece is painted as importantly as any other piece, whereas some of them might concentrate a little bit more on the Madonna's face or on the figure of the Madonna or on the main figures. Every square inch of this canvas is given great importance and handled just as carefully as any other part, even to the little rondelles of glass in the windows behind the dais that the Madonna sits on, the sort of baldacchino, a little overhanging canopy that forms the throne. Slide, please. He did a whole series of small Madonna paintings for private people or chapels, and they all fall more or less into the same category within a Flemish interior on this sort of throne-like effect with the elaborate rug underneath the leading up to the steps up to the Madonna, and then some sort of rich hanging behind her. Most of these things were quite tiny, whereas we have seen in the Italian Renaissance, where we have a lot of frescoes and wall paintings, this was unsuitable to the damp climate of the Gothic, of the Flanders area and the Gothic churches. So we find many more panel paintings, movable things of smaller scale, and tiny little things like most of these little Madonna paintings are around 6 by 8 inches. These could be used within the home, much as we use paintings today in a private chapel, or moved around as people traveled and they had their little religious shrines that they took with them. Slide, please. We also have the introduction of portraiture, away from completely religious aspect of art. And we see a close-up, and a beautiful one, of the artist himself, Jan van Eyck, often called the man in the red turban. But in the northern climates, many times we see in the self-portraits that to protect themselves from the cold, the artists would wrap their heads in some sort of a turban effect. Even later on, we'll see Rembrandt doing the same thing. But the attention to surface details, the sort of sag in the skin, the wrinkled effect, the softness, the almost blush of the cells that make up the skin surface, that you have a translucency of color. And what a kind, soulful gaze that we have from Mr. Van Eyck as he looked into the mirror, recording his own face. Slide, please. And then another major composition, again, sort of based on the same point as John Arnolfini and his wife. We have the Madonna with Chancellor Roland. Now this painting has not fared as well as some of Van Eyck's other ones. It has faded away, whereas the Canon van der Pijl's Chancellor Rowland's robes have sort of come down from a rusty red, just have faded into a dark brown, and the richness of the Madonna's robes have faded considerably. It is still sort of a unique painting in that we're allowed to see landscape, and landscape becomes an important part of painting. The two figures are equally balanced this time, and the mass of the figures then counteracts the pull of the perspective as your eye is pulled to the intricacy of the little Flemish village way out in the distance. We have sort of an elaborate little angel holding the crown above the Virgin's head, and the richness of the Chancellor's robes, again, contrasted with sort of the heavy woolen simplicity of the Madonna's robes as they fall in those sort of flat Vaneyck folds. Slide, please. Slide, please. With the Fleming's interest in the surface detail, many times they would build up with gesso a texture on the surface to actually form almost a three-dimensional effect, as he has in this crown, and then even sometimes inlay them with precious or semi-precious stones. Slide, please. And then as you gaze between the two figures out to the landscape, you have the bunch of lilies that are sort of isolated in the lower middle that, again, is a sign of purity or a symbol of purity. You have the peacocks over on the left-hand side that are a symbol of eternity. And then there's two sort of curious figures that bring your gaze through the ramparts there across out to the river. You see all sorts of little bustling activity of people crossing the bridges into the little city on the banks of the river. It is not known if Vaneyck used any certain village or city as his model, but it is thought to be just an imaginary composite of different Flemish buildings. Slide, please. The second artist that we will look at today is Hans Memling, M-E-M-L-I-N-G. And his dates are 1435 to 1494. Memling is one of the most enjoyable of the Flemish painters, strictly because he presents things in a very simple, sort of sensitive, quiet way. His people are very compelling. The portraits, about 25 of them that he did, show sort of a compassion toward humanity, of these people in prayerful attitudes, humbling themselves in front of the artist. And then his early things, more than likely influenced by Roger van der Weyden, another Flemish painter, using much the same type tradition in composition, except his colors are much lighter. They're more delicate than Van Eyck's. They're not as rich. His compositions are as well organized, and more or less the painting is done for the same reason. Back with the Gothic tradition of man looking at material things, sort of seeking a way to the divine. He has, as usual with the Flemings, a rich feeling of the interior, the Gothic structures. This is the presentation in the temple. Again, you have a lack of anatomy, but when we get to the portraits with Memling, you'll see sort of a basic style or characteristics of the way he presented his people. Slide, please. These all are fairly early. They are around 1460, 1470. And they are after the style of Roger van der Weyden. And again, rather than being mostly interiors, you see a lot of the landscape, where just toward the end of Van Eyck's life, do you see the landscape being introduced within painting. You find it a very important part of Memling's work. The people are outdoors, or they're by a window that allows for this sort of expansive space to be shown in the background surrounding the people. Again, much like the Northern Italian painters, you have sort of richness of form and of color, so an elaborate attention to the detail in the design of the fabrics. Slide, please. An adoration of the Magi, a fairly stiff, stilted thing. Slide, please. The surface detail of a Memling is beautiful. There seems to be a softness to it, even though that there's a crisp edge of where light meets dark. The overall effect is sort of a muted one, almost like under a veil. There's nothing harsh. Transitions are not abrupt. His paintings are easy to look at. They're sort of quiet and soft. This is St. John. Slide, please. In this, although it's a portrayal of Christ, you have the basic characteristics of most of his portrait work. As with most of the Flemish painters that we have looked at before, we see within the structure of the face small eyes and a fairly long nose, which makes an elongated cheek structure. With Memling's work, we still have these sort of tiny set eyes, again the long sort of skinny nose, but a great expanse of the jawline, which sort of makes the face longer from the eyes down to the chin than from the eyes up to the top of the head. Slide, please. He also did a whole series of the little Madonna paintings. Memling's work is a little bit larger than Van Eyck's. Most of it is sort of what we would call an average-sized painting today. Slide, please. Slide, please. In this one, as I said, you see an elaborate attention to this landscape that goes out the background. It is in great awe of the importance of the scene. There's nothing like in a Giotto work of where it's all humbleness of the Madonna and Child, but it is elevated sort of to a higher plane that when you look at this, you know it's an important scene. It's an important event. Most of the times, he also included these within Gothic frames or within Gothic framework. And as in this one, the arch is painted within the composition. Slide, please. This one is St. Veronica. Notice the nice medieval space that goes on beyond the figures. Slide, please. I think my favorite area of Memling's work is his portraits. They're almost sad people. They're never smiling. They're sort of in a pious position, and most of them either have their hands folded as in prayer or within some religious structure. But even though they'll have this religious overtone, the colors are beautiful. They're soft. They're delicate. The eyes are sort of kind, a little on the sad side. Slide, please. This man holds the medallion of his family's history. And you have the beautiful landscape in the background that creates a great space and lightness to the portrait. Now, most of the time at this period in Italian painting, you have the very dark background. But with the Flemings, they open it up and you see the sky and the land. Slide, please. You will see this pose used over and over again. His portraits were of the wealthy class of Bruges and of Brussels. Slide, please. And this is just a detail of a portrait of a lady. But you have that sort of translucent glow to the skin tones in a Memling. You really miss it in a slide reproduction. Slide, please. But even though they still fall into the same anatomical characteristics in the faces, they still maintain a strong individuality. Slide, please. Portrait of a lady with a pink. Slide, please. Slide, please. Portrait of an old man. This was later in style, where he was much more concerned with the characterization of the person rather than a portrayal. Slide, please. He did two little still lifes, the Chalice of St. John, that I think is a tiny painting that it is absolutely beautiful, and much as we will see later in the Dutch tradition of still life painting, catching the gleam and the light falling on objects. But a very simple presentation, beautiful in its simplicity. Slide, please. A vase of flowers. Slide, please. One of its major contributions was the tomb of St. Ursula that he decorated with paintings on the different sides. The rondelles or the medallions in the ceiling, or the top of the object were considered to be done by students. But we will see some of the details within this work. Slide, please. They would, of course, depict different events in the life of St. Ursula. But this would be considered almost Gothic painting. It's certainly within a Gothic structure. Slide, please. And the portrait of St. Ursula. Slide, please. For our review, we start off with Giotto, Giotto, an early Renaissance Florentine painter, highly influenced by the Byzantine style, introduced humanism. We have the flat plaited halos. The people are basically lined up still on the same frontal plane, but you do have a feeling of some depth or placement of objects in depth behind the figures. The drapery does not give the weight of the material itself, but just indicates folds in the drapery. Slide, please. Masaccio, who was about 100 years later, introduced atmosphere and a constant light source. His drapery, although still a little stiff, does indicate secondary folds and wrinkles, which gives it more of a feeling of fabric or of cloth. His faces were more round faces, broad across the eyes, and fairly heavy-lidded eyes. His halos were discs that floated above the heads. The backgrounds were soft, out of focus, to create an atmosphere or a feeling of depth in the back of his paintings. Slide, please. Botticelli, again later of the High Renaissance, had crisp, defined outlines almost within his face structure. If you look closely, there's almost like a little thin sienna line that defines the very edge of the feature. Highly influenced by Hellenistic Greek sculpture with the elaborate intertwined hairdos, and certainly his drapery structure is based on classic Greek sculpture. Slide, please. Leonardo da Vinci built up his pigment in transparent layers, in glazes, so there's a tremendous amount of depth as you look through color to see other color underneath it. Stylization of the face with the high arched brows, the long nose, and the deep set mouth, the little ringlets of curls carefully painted in on around the faces. Slide, please. Michelangelo was more of a painter of the 16th century, whereas Da Vinci was ending up the 15th century. The concept of painting was changing, of where they wanted more movement and activity within the composition, so that this could express more emotion. So his figures became more athletic, more active, more muscled, to show this activity within the human figure. Slide, please. And Raphael was the peak of the Renaissance, of where he took all the styles of everybody else and meshed them into his own style, a highly refined style. You see a lot of influences of the other painters, but a tremendous refinement of all the concepts of Renaissance art. Slide, please. The Flemish painters, the first one, Jan van Eyck, there's a tremendous amount of attention to surface detail. Like in some of his works, with symbolism, the floor tiles even have stories from the Old Testament. The brocades and fabrics are beautifully ornamented. You can almost feel the softness of furs when he depicts them. He placed his figures within northern or Gothic structures. Slide, please. And Hans Memling, who was definitely a Flemish painter, as they all had the same characteristics of the sort of bony fingers, the lack of anatomy, the small eyes, the long nose. But his people had a feeling of sort of honesty. They were never smiling or happy or showed much emotion, but sort of complacent people that had accepted their role in life. But you really feel like they would be nice, honest people to get to know them. Slide, please. Clear the machine.
And Peter Rubens, R-U-B-E-N-S. Put in the first slide, please. Peter Paul Rubens, R-U-B-E-N-S. Painter, diplomat, man of learning, was one of those rare figures in the history of art who completely dominated their age. He combined an indefatigable, enterprising spirit with enormous creative energy. This energy he channeled in many directions, becoming deeply involved in the intellectual, political, and spiritual life of his country. As a diplomat, he was continuously engaged in negotiations to bring peace to war-torn Flanders. But as an artist, his dynamic, exuberant, and sensual Baroque style swept aside the prevailing currents, and all painters reshaped their way of seeing in his image. Slide, please. The Descent from the Cross, painted in 1612, which is the center panel of the last slide that you saw, is the center of a triptych painted for the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Antwerp. It is very characteristic of Rubens' early classicizing manner and borrows extensively from the Italian Mannerists, such as Tintoretto. Although the figures are a bit bloated in all of Rubens' early work, they are strongly and individually modeled. It is the unity of conception of the organization and the diagonal sweep of the composition that sort of forms a single binding rhythm to the whole work. The whole idea of this is most striking and modern. Slide, please. In the large painting, The Rape of the Daughters of Lysippus, The painting represents the abduction of the daughters at their wedding ceremony by the illustrious twins of Zeus, Castor and Pollux. They appear to have put up relatively little resistance in their attempt to evoke the gods as really half-hearted. The odd thing of the moving composition, the sort of turbulence within the placement of the figures, is set in a very gently rolling Flemish landscape and not a mythological subject at all, except possibly for the nudity of the girls and the battle dress of the twins. But the calm setting, along with the Cupid attending the reins of one of the horses, points to the peaceful outcome of the story. In both the composition and the painting technique, the most expressive element is the use of counterpoint, the light. Enamel-like colors of the women's skin tones, for example, are set off by the dark complexions of Castor and Pollux. Their contrasts of coloring are again repeated in the pelts of the horses. Rubens' delight in playing off every texture is amply illustrated by the differences of the armor, drapery, flesh, the animals, different things. Similar contrasts are also found within the composition. Strongly accented diagonals are balanced by counter movements, which maintain sort of a state sense. The beautiful and spirited composition is one of Rubens' most lucid. In few other painted pictures is the ordering so clearly felt underneath all the outward appearance of this turbulence and fury. Slide, please. This impressive, explosive picture was painted for Maximilian, Duke of Bavaria, and possibly it had the aid of another Flemish painter, Vaneyck. Its subject is one that provided Rubens with an ideal outlet for his energy and dynamic potentials. The ferocious clash of man and animals is brought out with great realism, and the impact is made most effective by the placement of the action at our eye level, as if we were in the hunt ourselves. The dominant movement is the dramatic diagonal of the rider falling off his horse. But in order that our eyes are not forced beyond the picture frame, the hunter clad in red on the left and the fallen hunter on the right help balance this strong diagonal movement and square off the composition. All parts project outward, radiating toward the outside. The sort of pell-mell array of horses, men, and wild beasts is so violently torn from the center of the composition toward the sides that the fairly calm rectangle of the canvas seems scarcely able to contain it. Slide, please.